Hello. The downside of getting better lighting in your room is you start to see how horrible you look after having barely slept in a week. As always, this is Emma from Beanbag Books, and what was I going to talk about today? So the last couple of days I was watching some YouTube, as one does, and I happened to see a video from Jess Owens that talked about something called Squeecore. If you don't know Jess Owens, she often makes these videos that she calls book community, and the last three letters are TEA, and that's where she talks about all the hot tea being spilled in the book community, which is often very interesting to watch. And so she brought up the term Squeecore, and she mentioned that the podcast Rite Gud, I think it's supposed to be Rite Gud. I admittedly haven't listened to the podcast. But they had an episode recently that was all about this term, and the internet, as the internet does, had displeasure and showed it. I looked into the issue, looked at a lot of people's comments, read the transcript from the people who made the podcast, and I think that pretty much everybody is making some decent points, which is kind of unusual in a situation like this. So I just wanted to share a few of my thoughts, and if people think any differently from me or you think I've misunderstood something, feel free to let me know in the comments. Happy to talk. But first I'm going to start by defining the term Squeecore because I had no idea what it was. The troglodyte that I am. And I'm sure some other people might not either, so here we go. Squeecore, according to KnowYourBeam.com, is the current dominant literary movement in sci-fi and fantasy, SFF, writing, defined by its reliance on quote-unquote epic moments, snarky epic Bacon-style humor, young adult-style plots even when written for adults, wish fulfillment and victory by proxy, and tired tropes about banding together to defeat an ultimate evil, as well as progressive political influences and influences from TV and movies rather than literature. It is defined by the pod hands JR as a gentrified version of SFF. So, as I said before, I have seen a ton of mixed reactions to what these two podcasters were saying. A lot of people were saying that these podcasters were gatekeeping and that they don't want anybody to have fun and that people should just read whatever they want. And some people were saying, okay, I guess I kind of see their point here. I kind of get where this Squeecore concept is coming from. As I've said, I'm kind of two minds about this, and that's part of what I want to talk about with you. I think first I'm going to share some of the arguments that these podcasters made, some of which are excellent, and some of which I wish they had gone into a little bit more detail about because I think it's quite broad in many circumstances, which might contribute to people not really understanding it. And then I'm going to bring in an example of my own and talk about a few more. I also would like to note before I start that a lot of people seem to assume before listening to this podcast or knowing anything about it, reading the transcript, that the podcasters are just a couple of straight white men who are trying to dunk on progressive politics and marginalized writers. I did a little bit of research and I did see that the host of the podcast, whose name is Raquel S. Benedict, is a queer Puerto Rican woman. So think before you assume, folks. That's all I have to say about that. So the first argument I'm going to talk about that these two podcasters made that I quite liked was the emphasis on relatability in young adult literature especially, or in token diversity narratives. So we have this self-importance. We have this incredible precision bluntness when it comes to giving us the moral of the story. There's a rejection of ambiguity. Motivations must be spelled out. Plot developments must happen on the page without inferences or gaps in the narrative or in the lore. There is no room for negative space. Endings tend toward the tidy and neat, even the pat. But while the moral and stuff has to be really, really precise, there's also a weird vagueness. Like I've noticed that a lot of the time, Squeecore writers will write 3 synonyms instead of picking the right word. They'll use 2 different metaphors instead of picking which one is the best. And I notice a weird vagueness when it comes to details. Like, I remember reading one where the main character was this girl who likes reading fantasy books, and at the beginning she's reading a fantasy book, but it doesn't tell us what the book is. And that's a missed opportunity, because if you just gave us the title of a book, that could tell us so much about her taste, about her personality, about what she fantasizes about. There's a really, really good opportunity to introduce some kind of theme here. Like, I know it's cliche, but what if she's reading Alice in Wonderland? Then that kind of sets us up for what the story might be. Well, what if she's reading Tolkien? What if she's reading Outlaw of Gore, you know? I really like how Raquel S. Benedict puts this. I'm 90% sure it's her, and if it's not, then I will correct myself in the subtitles later. Because ever since I was a teen girl reading YA, I've really been frustrated by this emphasis on relatability, quote unquote, in protagonists to the detriment of the story that they're actually telling. It's more like emptiness of character in the name of relatability. When YA protagonists are just these blah blank slates intended for readers to like project themselves onto, it's actually more condescending than it is helpful, as if we wouldn't like a book that was about someone other than ourselves. There are good ways to create cipher protagonists like this. I might make a video on this in the future, but a lot of the time, it's done very poorly. And this style also means that authors whose experiences don't fit the standard racial or heteronormative mold struggle to fit into it and find their own audiences. And that's kind of the next point that I want to talk about. I mean, it depends on the stories that you're telling. Something I found overwhelmingly by talking to other Latinx writers is that if you stick a Latinx character into a standard SFF narrative, that'll sell. But if you try to tell a story that's much more Latinx, let's say it's much more influenced by magical realism, or it goes in detail about Puerto Rican culture, or it's about colonization, or it's about being Latinx, or it deals with being Latinx in a complex way, you're going to have a much harder time selling it. For the most part, I have the privilege to know that people who look like me and people whose stories are similar to mine in terms of demographics and ethnic background are quite omnipresent in literature today. But as someone who translates literature from Spanish and has a translation degree, I can empathize with what she's talking about here too. It's incredibly frustrating to come up against people who refuse to try a translated book because it isn't based explicitly in white Western storytelling tradition, or they'll try one translated book and then refuse to try another one because, oh, that was just the good one. Later on in the podcast, I won't quote it directly here for the sake of time, but they do discuss Fernanda Melchor's novel Hurricane Season, translated into English by, I think it's Megan McDowell. Again, I'll correct myself if I'm wrong about that. I haven't read this book, but I've heard really excellent things about it, and they talk about how it's a really fascinating way to take storytelling tropes from like a Central American tradition, but how they were kind of concerned that a lot of people wouldn't like it because it is so explicitly like Mexican in its construction and draws from like Mexican ways of telling stories. So I totally agree and empathize with that point, and I think it is a huge problem to try to create these like totally blah protagonists that anybody could just fit themselves into, because really, realistically, not anyone will be able to do that. They also talk about how it's a lot easier for a white author to write a diverse character that just slots into an otherwise very Western narrative than for somebody who's marginalized to write a story based in their own tradition with a protagonist who looks like them and has a history like theirs, and then try to get that published. And that is very true. That is incredibly frustrating and unfair. They go on to talk a little bit about how a lot of times these Squeecore stories try to conceptualize reading as this work of activism that inherently makes you better. These are stories that are congratulating you for reading them without really challenging you. They're telling you you're so special and good for reading this. A writer I shall not name was promoting the work of a friend writer of his that I also shall not name, posting her story saying, "This is justice." No, it's a story, dude. It's not justice. It doesn't do anything. It is a story. You read it and then you go on with your life. Go outside, do some mutual aid work, touch some fucking grass, go to a demonstration. I don't know, but writing or reading a story is not a fictional story, is not activism. It's not justice, it doesn't fucking do anything, it's incredibly self-important to tell yourself that you're literally changing the world. I mean, yeah, true. So far I've been agreeing with pretty much everything that they're saying. This is the point where we sort of start to get a point where I agree with a lot of what they're saying and I see their own points, but I could also see a counter argument. Let's look at this part about why Squeecore itself might be so popular. I think a lot of it is yearning for safety in a world that feels unsafe and unstable. I mean, we're in year 2 of a global pandemic, the environment is bad, democracy doesn't look like it's doing super good. It's very understandable to want to cling to stuff that makes you feel good about yourself and makes you feel safe. Yeah, and that's the excuse they'll use, and I think that that's valid. Obviously, I'm not going to take away Like, if you want comfort fiction, it's there, it's good. If it gets you through the day, that's awesome. But I especially think now that people are being raised almost entirely on a diet of that, and that there is almost an inability to see fiction any other way except as reassurance. It's like they believe in their hearts that fiction has one rightful purpose, and that's reassurance and safety and relatability, and things that are outside of that are suspicious and maybe contemptuous. So I think that this is important to touch on before we go into some of what else they're saying, because I don't necessarily believe, like a lot of people, that these podcasters' intent is to shame people for enjoying feel-good narratives. I think that perhaps they could have expressed it a little bit better later on, but I do think that they understand the feeling of wanting to read something that's really comforting in a time when not a lot is very comforting. The main problem is when that's all that you want to read. And that is something that I have seen just on Goodreads and on BookTube in some places where people get upset because something isn't happy or isn't joyful. I actually read an article recently where someone was mad because the cover of a book was yellow and it wasn't a happy book. And they were like, well, this cover was yellow, that makes you think it's going to be happy, and yellow is a color. I don't know. I kind of don't know what you want there. I do, however, think it's interesting that they say this and then they go on to elaborate, and it almost feels like they're undercutting a little bit what they've previously said. So maybe you're asking, so what, is aspirational bad now? And that's the kind of reductive, defensive question you'd naturally ask if you believed that aspirational was the only purpose of fiction. The instinct to get defensive about the question means you probably attach a lot of value to that aspirational feeling, that frisson, that nebulous sense of hope. This allows for a lot of great storytelling, yes, but what it disallows is just as interesting. It disallows tragedy and disappointment. It disallows losers, fuck-ups, failures, fools, clowns, edgelords, liars, and perverts, and freaks, and criminals, and yes, depraved monsters that you'd never want to be within 100 miles of. Squeecore disallows the unhappy ending, the disappointment, the rawness, the hopelessness, the truth that sometimes you never get what you want, and the discomforting possibility that maybe you don't deserve it. It disallows waste and relapse and pointlessness. In short, it disallows a huge spectrum of the human experience. This is a really interesting paragraph that I think kind of encapsulates why perhaps this message is not getting across to a lot of people. I think it's honestly a little bit unclear here whether or not Squeecore is the overall sentiment that all literature should be aspirational and fluffy and sweet and should make you feel good about yourself, or whether it's any individual book that falls into that category is sort of blamed for the entire sentiment. And that's just something that I don't know if they ever clarify. It seems like at the beginning they're talking about a genre, but then they start going into individual examples. I think that Squeecore is a more useful term when it talks about an overall sort of idea. I think that many individual books that fall under this category aren't necessarily bad on their own, but if that's all that you ever want to read and you shun everything that doesn't make you feel good or doesn't challenge you or doesn't make you question yourself and how you interact with the world around you, that's where it gets bad. But I think that that's not being communicated super well here, and that's why a lot of people are confused about it, and I don't blame them. I don't personally think that the existence of one positive narrative that maybe is, upholding some Squeecore elements erases all of these other books that aren't. But I do think that as readers, you do have a responsibility to make sure that you're challenging yourself, even if you do generally prefer feel-good books. There's nothing wrong with that preference, but there is something wrong with excluding all other options. Yes, people should read what they want, but for example, let's say you really like romance. If you only read romance that is between people who look like you, or, by characters that have the same sexuality as you, or even where nothing traumatic has ever happened in the protagonist's past. I know that many romances do include some traumatic backstories for their protagonists. Then you're doing yourself a disservice. It's your choice, but also you're doing yourself a disservice. That's just what I think. These podcasters kind of resisted going into actual examples of Squeecore because I think they thought they'd get a lot of backlash or that it would be too mean. And I understand that feeling, but I also think that this contributed to an overly general application of the concept of Squeecore and why so many people don't seem to understand what it's about. They do list a couple of examples at the very end of the podcast where they don't even really explain them, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But first I'm going to provide my own example of something that I read not too long ago that I think falls under Squeecore, and then describe how I think it might apply to it. So if you've watched my content before, and I don't blame you if you haven't, because I'm kind of a scrub brush, you've probably heard me talk about how underwhelmed I was by T.J. Klune's The House on the Cerulean Sea. And this, in fact, was the first thing I thought of when Jess Owens on her video was initially describing Squeecore. I read this book a while ago, shortly after it took almost the entirety of book 2 by storm, and I did think it was cute, but it wasn't this show-stopping fantasy masterpiece the way people were kind of making it out to be, at least to me. It didn't make me believe in love, it didn't restore my faith in humanity, or anything like that. It honestly was a little bit boring. I thought that the presentation of the book, although cute, was kind of juvenile, especially considering that it's an adult book. The writing is kind of cheesy and repetitive, especially the dialogue, which has a lot of, in this house we respect each other, and platitudes like that I don't think adults need to have repeated for them over and over. This book, by the way, is about an orphanage for magical children who have been mistreated by the world, and the characterization of those children was pretty one note. Every one of them had this one defining trait that usually was sort of this device to make them seem really cute and lovable, and those traits were just sort of repeated many times. There's also a lot of silly humor and emphasis on found family, and there's also a gay romance at the center, which is great. That was one of the aspects I liked more about the book, actually. But it does check a lot of those Squeecore kind of boxes where they're showing this narrative that's progressive in a very moralistic and straightforward way. The House in the Cerulean Sea has also come under some fire, partly because of the author's assertion that he was inspired to write this book partly by the history of residential schools for Indigenous children in Canada. And this was made even more of a statement due to the fact that in the last year or so, hundreds, if not thousands, of unmarked graves of these children were found in Canada. A lot of readers were upset about the idea that the author seemed to be putting forth, which is that this deeply entrenched issue of racism towards Indigenous people could be fixed by a lighthearted story, especially one that ends, with one man's love conquering all and making everything okay for the children and things like that. So I do also see this kind of neoliberal mindset creeping in that the podcasters discussed. I, of course, want to be clear that I don't think this book is horrible. I don't think that there's no value in it. I did get, some enjoyment out of reading it. But the things that I didn't enjoy about it, I think that the Squeecore description really helped me identify what those things were and why they were bothersome to me. Also, the immense popularity of this book got me to thinking about why people like it so much, because undoubtedly people do, whatever I may think. And I think a lot of it is that the older we get, the less we get to read fun, feel-good fantasy and sci-fi novels, otherwise known as cozy fantasy. Not too long ago, I watched a video from Answer in Progress, and she really well captures why people are reading less, and consequently why they gravitate toward comfort reads and guilty pleasures, quote unquote, when they do. It's that reading is actually really, really hard. There's been a lot of research done about the difficulty of reading because cognitively you have to synthesize information while also converting it into visuals or however else you may process the information, using only your brain, no visual aids to really help you. And just like anything, if you don't practice, it gets harder to start up again. So if you haven't read in a long time, you're probably not going to go straight to Ulysses or something like that. And as the podcast acknowledged, the state of the world right now is such that it's natural to want to read something fun. Now, at the conclusion of the podcast, I do rattle off a few examples, only one of which I had any familiarity with, and I haven't read it. It's called The Goblin Emperor by Katherine and Addison. And they mention a review that a friend of theirs wrote, which I skimmed over. And the point that the reviewer makes is that the plot of The Goblin Emperor kind of reinforces this idea of a good monarch who does what he has to do while also completely ignoring the plight of working class people who often are sacrificed to the narrative, at their own expense. He mentioned that the book might have worked a lot better had the emperor in the book been willing to acknowledge that the system currently in place wasn't working and try to use his power to do more to help the workers, but he just didn't, according to this review. But the rest of the book to me really didn't sound like it fit into Squeecore. I understand how that sort of thread of that story can be an issue, and I think it's right to point it out if you see it, but I don't think that means that it's necessarily Squeecore. I was a little bit confused about why they were listing these things as examples when it just seemed to be a catch-all at this point for a fantasy novel that I think isn't exploring issues in enough depth. Then they offer some examples of anti-Squeecore, almost all of which are pretty dark. For example, R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War. I've heard a lot of good things about it, but I personally haven't read it yet because I know how incredibly grim it's going to be, for good reason. And I'm just waiting until I'm at a point in my life where I think I can handle that. So I don't blame people if they're not ready for something like that. I do mention Carmen Maria Machado, who I love and can completely endorse, and I wouldn't call her stuff happy either. There's some sarcastic wit in it that can make it a little bit less dense and dark, but it still is relatively dark. The podcasters seem to be very knowledgeable, intelligent people, and I'm sure that their recommendations are good, but my question is whether or not these recommendations are going to make it to the people who actually need them. Simply because I think people who read Squeecore are doing so because they're searching for feel-good reads. To me, it makes a little bit more sense to recommend books that maybe aren't quite so far on the end of like the dark spectrum, but maybe make you feel good, but aren't really Squeecore, but discuss these issues in more depth, that talk about difficult topics in a meaningful way that doesn't sacrifice the quality of the writing, especially ones that are grounded in the traditions of marginalized cultures or feature non-heteronormative storylines. Maybe these podcasters really didn't intend to recommend books to people who enjoy Squeecore. Maybe they were just offering examples of things that really aren't Squeecore, and I respect that. Maybe that's what they were doing. I personally am going to offer some books up that I think could be considered kind of feel-good reads, but also aren't what I would call Squeecore as I've just described it to be. Not all of these are complete favorites of mine, but I did enjoy them, and I hope that some other people might enjoy them too. Miranda and Milan by Katherine Duckett. This is kind of a sequel to Shakespeare's The Tempest. It features a romance between two women and a very well-researched Renaissance setting. There is some intrigue and darkness here. There is a bit of a dark plot, but it is an enjoyable read overall with many hopeful elements. The Empress of Sultan Fortune by Nghi. This is a really beautiful poetic novella that is based in East Asian folklore about a remarkable empress and the people who knew and loved her. Also some very good queer representation in this one, including a non-binary main character, which if you're not looking for it, you probably don't see very often. The Order of the Pyramid Reflected in Water by Zhen Cho. This is a novella written in English, but it's inspired by the Chinese wuxia tradition. Very solid queer/trans representation, and some good philosophical musings that are all wrapped up in a fun buddy comedy type story. And finally, I actually own this book so I can hold it up. Space Invaders by Nona Fernandez, and it's translated by Natasha Wimmer. This is a book that I wouldn't necessarily call feel good in most senses of the word. It can be pretty dark. It's a book about Pinochet-era Chile, and especially about a young girl named Estrella who disappeared from her school along with her entire family, and the children who remember her later and have memories of her and this video game that they used to play with her called Space Invaders. I think that this is probably a good kind of gateway book for people who want to expand a little bit from more feel-good, safe reads, but are a little bit afraid of extreme gore and very traumatic storylines, while also giving you a chance to explore an era of history that I know a little bit about because I studied abroad in Chile, and I really think should be talked about more, especially the connection that the United States had to this and a lot of dictatorships in Latin America. It's really skinny. I don't think it's even 100 pages, and it's really good. And more people should talk about Nona Fernandez. That's all. So, all in all, I want to emphasize that though I don't completely agree with every single thing these podcasters have said, I don't think that their perspective is wrong or should be discounted. Although their generalizations are a little bit sweeping for me, I think that they have a lot of really good points on fake token diversity versus real diverse stories, but I think it's really important for people who want to be serious about reading to keep in mind. Whew, you have heard me talk for way too long, so I think I'm gonna sign off. You'll see me again soon. I'm gonna try to post a little bit more regularly if you actually care. So keep a lookout for a few more book videos from me coming soon. Bye.